You clicked on the video. I'm making the video. It's pretty clear we know what we are. But do you even remember why? And the quality of our lives, from this point on referred to only as cool, is integral to our survival as a species. I'm actually not joking. Quality of life is pretty important when it comes to games. We love quality of life features. We complain about the lack thereof. We want our games to be pretty smooth experiences. We like to have fun here, right? But actually, it's a pretty nuanced topic, and as with pretty much everything with game design, there are kind of a lot of factors that go into it. Now, there definitely are a lot of games that are probably missing a lot of quality of life features, but I would actually argue that there's a lot of games that actually have too many or too much quality of life consideration. Now don't roll your eyes or click off, please. I know this could potentially sound like this is about to turn into the ramblings of a man who gets incredibly angry whenever a game has like a simple accessibility feature or something like that. This isn't what that is at all. I'm a game developer. I kind of develop games. That's what my whole channel is about. So what I'm specifically talking about is a sort of phenomenon where a quality of life feature can actually accidentally conflict with the core design of a game, or maybe the intended or core experience of a game. And you might be wondering, how can a feature that a developer put in a game accidentally go against the experience that they were intending for a player to experience? Well, first of all, we have things like remakes, remasters, sequels that aren't directed by the same people, all that kind of stuff. But game design is hard. It's actually pretty hard, and it's, again, nuanced, and there's a lot of things that go into it. You have to do a lot of stuff all at once. A game is a lot of moving parts together, so it's actually very easy to accidentally put something in your game that is probably doing not exactly what you wanted it to be doing. But first, let's establish a baseline of an actual quality of life feature that I think is pretty just cut and dry. It's just a good feature and it makes sense and it doesn't conflict with any kind of gameplay, any kind of core design or anything like that. And I think the easiest one for me is thinking of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Comparing that to the other 3D Zelda games that came before it, let's just use Ocarina of Time for simplicity. And we're talking about the item menus. In Ocarina of Time, the way it worked is you would have to navigate a pretty slow moving menu to go all the way over to the item that you wanted to select and equip it to your button. And again, sometimes this could even be on different pages of the menu. Really not too bad, but compared to Twilight Princess, in that game, the item selection was added to a circular menu wheel. And so all you had to do to equip an item was open the item menu and just use your 360-degree analog stick to just point to whichever item you wanted. And it's great because it didn't matter how many items Link eventually collected over the course of the game, this system worked for any number of items. So not only does this change massively cut down on time spent in menus and cut down on button presses, especially in the context of Zelda games where you're constantly switching items and things like that, but it accomplished that while not actually altering the core gameplay at all. The way items work in real time in the midst of the actual gameplay, it's completely identical. So all this feature has done is decrease the amount of time that the player is spending in a menu as opposed to playing the game. So yeah, like I said, pretty cut and dry. We like that. And really the Zelda series is a pretty great outlet to look at in terms of something like quality of life because there's just a massive amount of history of iteration and innovation. In talking about the newest Switch era games, so Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, we could pull a lot of great examples from it. As compared to the rest of the series, item pickups are much faster. For example, after getting a fairy for the first time, every single time you get one afterwards, it's just immediately added to your inventory. You don't get the same cutscene every single time. And it's got the added bonus of having that classic Zelda fanfare happen the first time you actually get it. It happens at least once. Another nice little thing that I like is the arrow number being added to the reticle of the arrows, so you can easily keep track of it while you're shooting instead of having it off to the side of the screen or whatever, which also makes the HUD look a little bit nicer. Then, even just going from Breath of the Wild to Tears of the Kingdom, there's some good stuff. One of my favorites, opening a chest with a weapon in it whenever you had a full weapon inventory looked like this in Breath of the Wild. And it looks like this in Tears of the Kingdom. A change like this in a game where you're playing 50, 150, 500 hours in is a pretty big difference. It adds up. Similarly to that, they added a sort and drop option directly to the weapon menus in-game. The ability selection in Breath of the Wild was replaced with one more similar to Twilight Princess for Tears of the Kingdom, which is good. And there's even little things like adding the ability to look at dialogue logs. This is all really good stuff. It's the kind of thing you want to think about whenever you're making your own games, maybe. But just looking at the examples that we've had already, it can be pretty easy to think that quality of life just boils down to convenience or streamlining, speed, basically. And now, gamer, we have to ask ourselves a hard question. Is convenience always good? Let's ask my script. So for simplicity's sake, let's just say we stay on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. In those games, you can hold basically as many cooked dishes as you want. And also, the way you consume cooked dishes is just by opening up the menu, clicking on it, and that's it. Link has immediately gotten the benefits of that cooked dish. It's very fast, it's very convenient. Having a really high limit on something like cooked dishes makes sense in an open world game compared to something like Ocarina of Time, where even in that game or Twilight Princess or something like that, a lot of times it'd be really easy to run into resources that you'd want to pick up, but you were limited to your number of bottles or something like that. We're gonna get into this. Limitations aren't bad, but I'll leave it at saying that arguably the Zelda series historically has had a little bit of wiggle room there with being more convenient. So especially going open world, not bad. Theoretically. In practice, these two features are actually so powerful together, they can actually very easily encourage players to completely ignore really interesting mechanics that the developers clearly put a lot of thought and work into. For example, you could just do this. This is totally unupgraded armor. It's not like I have full hearts or anything like that. And I just have a ton of fully replenishing health dishes that I can just spam the moment that I take any damage. And these are all single ingredient dishes. They're not hard to make. They're very easy to figure out. It's one of the first things you figure out in the game. It's not hard to collect this many full heart recovery dishes. So the player's not even really engaging with scavenging and cooking that much whenever they use this method. And maybe you look at this and you say, well, actually, isn't this kind of a good thing? Players who don't want to do this don't have to, and players who aren't very good at combat can still experience the rest of the game by doing this. In this scenario, not only is it important to note that in Breath of the Wild, you essentially don't have to kill a single enemy in the game in the first place to enjoy it. But second, what this is really doing, it's bypassing a whole load of much more interesting mechanics that the developers put in the game as an alternative to combat. A big thing about Breath of the Wild is being creative and adaptive. Same with Tears of the Kingdom. If you're not good at hand-to-hand combat in Breath of the Wild, that's totally fine. What the designers really want you to do is use stealth. Sneak strikes are really powerful, especially if you combine that with something like waiting for night when they're asleep, or if it's raining to cover up the sound of your footsteps. Freezing enemies totally locks them up, and then you can do stupid things like pushing them off a cliff. If you want to make a tough enemy less imposing to fight hand-to-hand, you can shock them with something, make them drop their weapon. If you want to, you could even pick it up. Use wind. Half the enemies die if you just knock them in the water. There's lava, cliffs, and water in a bunch of places. You can use the cooking in a slightly more interesting way, and maybe give yourself some kind of buff beforehand, like a defense boost or an attack boost. Maybe you can get your speed up, or you can eat a hearty dish or something like that that gives you a bunch of extra hearts before the fight. Drop some bees on them. Make them fight each other. Make some kind of clever little machine so you just don't even have to fight them at all in the first place. They don't even have to notice you. But the point here is, if the easiest and most obvious thing to do is to just spend a lot of time in a boring menu just spamming healing items, a lot of players will just do that. And that's sort of coming back around to our, isn't this sort of a good thing for players who maybe aren't so good with the combat to be able to do something like this? Because truthfully, regardless if a player thinks it's boring, a lot of times when people play games, they just tend to default to going the path of least resistance. Again, even if they think it's boring. Even if those people would have more fun and a more memorable experience by going any of those other routes, chances are they probably just won't. Some people are a little bit better at making their own fun whenever they play a video game, and some people, whether they know it or not, really prefer to have a very curated experience with their game. And I think even people that can make their own fun with games can agree that being forced to be more creative can be a lot more fun. As a game designer, it's your job, whenever you're designing your mechanics and your features, to be trying to point the player in the direction of playing the game that you think will be the most fun. Obviously, players aren't always going to do that, and sometimes players find out how to have more fun with your game. But there does have to be an idea and a vision there in the first place. That's your job as a game designer. And that's what I mean whenever I say these features are conflicting with the other mechanics of Breath of the Wild. They're almost making them redundant. But it doesn't mean we need to go back to bottles, and it doesn't mean that we need to go back to slower menus and all that other stuff. It just means that we could tweak it slightly. If Link could only eat at times that were logical to him, so let's say whenever he's not climbing, whenever he's not swimming, when he's not in the air, and when he's not in the middle of combat. If he could only eat when he wasn't doing one of those 4 things, then that would basically solve our problem completely. It would also stop players from being able to spam stamina potions in the air or while they're swimming or while they're climbing. Similarly to what I was talking about before, you know, there's a lot of creative ways to get over chasms and water and cliffs in these games. So let's try and make the player use them a little bit. So we'd have all that back, and the good news is that these would still be great quality of life features. Eating directly from the menu is very convenient, not having to go through a whole animation where time pauses to do it. And being able to hold any amount of cooked dishes and materials is pretty great too, with this little tweak. It's just now the convenience isn't going too far to the point of conflicting with the mechanics of the game, and therefore what the designers clearly want for the player, which is to both test and foster their creativity and adaptability. I think it's time to move on to another example and another game, because when Skyward Sword was re-released for the Nintendo Switch, it was also released with a Loftwing amiibo. And what that amiibo did was it let you scan it, then from anywhere on the surface, Link would pop back up to the sky to Skyloft, could do whatever you want in Skyloft, and then the next time you used that amiibo again, it would take you right to that exact point that you warped from. So essentially it's just a warp back to Skyloft, warp back to where you were whenever you did it. And yes, there is an entire conversation to be had about how stupid it is to break off part of your video game and put it in just a completely different package, physical or digital, by the way, for no reason other than to sell it or just have it be separate. That's a fine conversation to have. Talk about that all day. Even when it just comes to the conversation of game preservation, it is dumb to only halfway put a feature in your game to where it might not survive in the future. However, that discussion totally overshadowed the conversation about whether or not that was even a good idea to put that feature in Skyward Sword in the first place. The majority of the comment section on that amiibo video is basically just everyone saying how stupid or annoying or greedy it is that a quote-unquote quality of life feature was locked to a physical amiibo. And to be honest, that is the more important conversation. But I'm making a video about the minutiaes of quality of life features in video games. I'm a game designer, so I just want to talk about that more. That's more fun. The point is, a kind of interesting thing about Skyward Sword was coming back up to Skyloft so you could plan your expedition and get the gear that you wanted for your next expedition down to the surface. Skyward Sword actually introduced the different shield types and shield durability to the Zelda series, not Breath of the Wild. So if you brought the wrong kind of shield or you didn't bring it back to get repaired, then it could actually kind of leave you in a tough spot. That was the point. And it kind of helped sell the surface as an uncharted area that was dangerous to explore without properly preparing yourself. If in the middle of exploring between checkpoints, you were to lose all of your shields and your potions and you were at low hearts, if you could just immediately warp back up to the bazaar and then warp right back to exactly where you were before. Again, this is a situation where it's nullifying a unique thing about Skyward Sword. The trade-off or the punishment for not preparing yourself properly is now you have to make a decision. Do I trek forward without my shields or my potions? That's so dangerous. Or do I go all the way back to the last bird statue, fly back to the bazaar, and then fly back to the last checkpoint I was at, not right here, and then all the enemies come back, they'll respond. I'm so stupid! That's what's supposed to happen anyways. And of course, I will level with you. Skyward Sword's a very easy game, so is trekking forward without a shield that much harder? At later parts in the game, yeah, it does get harder. But again, hopefully you see my point. Side quest time. Gamer side quest time. Wind Waker HD, the Wii U re-release of the GameCube game. In order to make sailing a little bit less boring than the GameCube version, they didn't just make it to where you could just warp between islands. It was just to slightly increase the speed and the ease of navigation. Sailing on the ocean is a very important atmospheric and thematic element of Wind Waker. If you totally cut it out or just like cut it down a lot, the game would probably be a lot more convenient, would probably be more streamlined and faster, but it would be worse. Say goodbye to that amazing feeling of seeing an island finally start peeking out over the horizon and silhouetted and you wonder what it is. No more smooth transitions from the triumphant sailing theme to the quiet white noise driven self-reflection of sunset as the stars come out. You need that stuff. You need it there, right? Just making it so the boat goes a little bit faster and making it to where every time the player wants to change the direction of the wind, they don't have to stop and actually physically get out the Wind Waker is much better than just letting Link be able to fast travel to every single island he's already been to. And what's key about this quality of life feature is that it was introduced as an item in the game. In Skyward Sword, the surface warping might have been a great quality of life change if it was just introduced around the halfway point in the game as an item that Link could actually get in-game. We're back from our gamer side quest. At the halfway point in Skyward Sword, seemingly something kind of started going down in the development of the game. It seems very possible that they were just trying to hit a very specific release date, and they might have even had a runtime for the game mandated. So, potentially, with the intention of padding the game's runtime out, Skyward Sword asks the player to do a lot of traveling back and forth to areas that they've already pretty much fully explored or unlocked a lot of bird statues already. So adding warping then might be a pretty great quality of life change, right? Makes sense to me. Makes sense to Mr. Dark Souls. He did it. Definitely faced with some time crunch and development issues towards the end of development. The second half of Dark Souls isn't nearly as intricately woven together as the first half is. And that's exactly the point in the game where Dark Souls gives you warping. For a million reasons, Dark Souls benefits greatly from not including warping in the first half of the game. But when the warping actually comes, it's definitely a positive change and a real quality of life improvement, at least considering how the layout of the game ended up by the end of development. So like we were talking about with the item system with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, we're seeing that balance and context are very important when it comes to quality of life features. And that really is the point. Every game and what it does uniquely well needs to be considered individually when it comes to things like polishing the experience and smoothing out the gameplay with things like quality of life. I know that there are newer game developers who are watching this video right now, and so that's kind of just all I want to impart. Identify what's fun about your game, or identify what it is that you want players to experience with your game. Let's take an example. Let's say your game is like roguelike or dungeon crawler or something, and pretty much all you do in your game is you fight monsters so you can get their loot and their materials and all the gamer things that they carry with them. And so you can take those to turn them into more weapons or materials or whatever, so you can go fight more monsters, right? Like that's your gameplay loop. If the part that you want to focus on is fighting the monsters and maybe managing your resources while you're fighting them, say something that you have to do is craft a bunch of arrows or something like that. If the fun part is fighting the monsters and managing your resources, then just, for God's sakes, let me craft 100 arrows with one button press. You know, don't make me watch the same cutscene of somebody making something 600 times while playing your game. Maybe you have like a blacksmith character and you want the blacksmith to have some dialogue to the player. Don't make me mash through it every time. It's gonna make me hate that guy. Maybe do something like have his dialogue play or the dialogue box come up as you're in the menu deciding what to do and as he's doing an animation and working, right? It's like, I'm doing what I gotta do, this guy's doing what he's gotta do, and he's having a conversation with me while it's happening. That's cool, I like that, and it's way faster and doesn't have the opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve, right? But let's just immediately go the opposite direction. Let's say your game is actually like a sim type game, a simulation type game, and it's very immersive and it's very realistic. Maybe the graphics aren't, but you know, the point is it's like very immersive. And maybe it's like just a survival thing, mostly. And so occasionally it's going to be important that I shoot some animal so I can eat it and not starve to death. Or there's some monster that occasionally shows up and I can shoot a couple arrows at it to defend myself or whatever, right? So maybe in that game, maybe don't let me craft 100 arrows with one button press, right? You know, maybe don't put my arrow count on the reticle. like in Breath of the Wild, right? Maybe don't even give me an arrow count, you know what I mean? Maybe in this deeply immersive game that's a survival game, maybe it's on me to painstakingly craft every single arrow one at a time or something like that, you know? And if that's the case, maybe it should also be on me to mentally be able to keep track of how many arrows I have, or just give me a way to visually see it, and while I'm shooting, it's my job or something like that, right? You know? Now, obviously that's going in the complete opposite direction, but it's still valid. That's a valid kind of video game to make. And yeah, sure, maybe in that game, there is still room for some quality of life or something, you know, a little bit of fat trimming. Maybe let me craft 5 arrows instead of 1 at a time, or maybe let me craft 10 arrows, but maybe I lose a little bit of extra daylight. Maybe my hunger meter goes up, maybe my sleepy time meter goes up, you know, all that kind of stuff to kind of compensate for it. I mean, that's also all well and good, but even then that kind of changes the essence of the game a little bit. Again, balance and context. I've been telling them this whole time. I'm sure you're almost done just listening to me drive home this single point about this very specific topic. But since the vibe and theme of the video so far has been like, here's how quality of life can ruin your game, and it's a very delicate balancing act, and it's impossible to do it right, and you suck. That's obviously not the point. I do just want to say that I can't think of a single quality of life feature that I would consider universally bad for games. Maybe there's a conversation about some quality of life features becoming a little bit too pervasive in game design and has kind of been a little detrimental in that way, but that's a totally different conversation. But like I said, individually, I can't think of a single quality of life feature that is always a bad thing, that would always conflict with every game. And on the other end, I actually think there are some quality of life features that do basically fit in every single game, you know? Honestly, you've heard people say it a million times, skipping cutscenes is a pretty big one. The point is, cutscenes are static normally, and gameplay isn't. So assuming that someone wants to play your game more than once, which hopefully you should want them to do that, then on repeat playthroughs, it's nice to not bog them down with the static stuff, you know? And again, we're just talking about giving them the option to skip through that stuff if they don't want to. Even if you took a game like Until Dawn or Life is Strange, where a huge part of those games is watching cutscenes and seeing how the cutscenes change based on your decisions and stuff like that, and getting different cutscenes. Cutscene skipping is not a bad quality of life change in that scenario for a couple reasons. One, it's always going to be optional, and giving the player the option to skip a cutscene doesn't interact with other gameplay systems, right? Two, video games aren't TV shows. I know that like Life is Strange releases episodically and things like that, but even episodes can be pretty long, and so if there's a part that a player wants to see again or experience again, it's best to let them just get to that part quickly, since they can't just literally fast forward to it. And three is very similar to that last part, where maybe the player wants to play through the game again, but they only want to change their choices and all that stuff for like the last third of the game. So for them, the first 2/3 of the game are going to look basically identical to their last playthrough, and the last third is going to give them new cutscenes and things like that. So it's a good feature. Let me know in the comments if you can think of a scenario where you think that being able to skip cutscenes is actually like bad for a game. Clearly, I run on being pedantic, so I actually would love to see what you guys could come up with. And if you could convince me, that would be amazing. I would love that. It would be more fuel for my point. But otherwise, completely related to that, in my book, a great quality of life feature always is asking the player to hold a button for a second, or to press it twice to confirm skipping a cutscene, or essentially initiating one. Like if there's something in a game where talking to an NPC takes a very long time or something like that, it's nice to make sure the player didn't accidentally initiate that or accidentally skip it, because that can be infuriating. Especially skipping cutscenes by accident can be really annoying. And what I would consider to be a kind of big universal quality of life feature would be making like the fail state or the game over state quick and painless. Like take Celeste, for example. You die, you're back in. And don't get me wrong, all right? I don't mean that every game should work exactly like Celeste, where the challenges are really short and you can immediately try the same challenge over and over. In the first Castlevania, if you die to a boss, then you go back to the last checkpoint. You don't just get to keep retrying the boss over and over. That's just how that game works. What I mean is let the player start playing your video game again as fast as possible. If you want to punish them for dying, you want to send them back to a checkpoint, or you want to do something weird and wacky to them, be my guest. I love that stuff. But just let them start playing the game again. There's an interactive medium, and it lives and dies by its interactivity. So yeah, like I said in Castlevania, you die to a boss, you go back to a checkpoint, but that takes like 1 second. It takes like no time at all to do that. Oh, and if you're wondering why making the player replay a part of a level they've already played is different than not letting the player skip a cutscene they've already seen, is because, again, gameplay is variable. Cutscenes are static. Even though you've already played that part of that level, technically anything should be able to happen. The outcome is not guaranteed, at least if the game is designed pretty well. So anyways, all that being said, I would say a great quality of life feature is one that aims to kind of simplify and streamline any parts of a game that are not reinforcing the game's core design and intention, while also making sure that it is not contradicting the core design or the intention of the game, even if that just means minor mechanics. Pretty much all quality of life features are subject to the context of the game, and the degree to which a quality of life feature is implemented needs to be balanced on a case-by-case basis. I counted on my fingers, but that was only 2 things. You know, at least all this is in my opinion. Hopefully I've kind of convinced you to thinking a similar way. But also, if not, just tell me. I'm super interested to hear. Like I said, I'm a game developer. This is a channel of game developers. So, of course, I want to know like what people are generally thinking about this kind of thing. But on the subject of me being a game developer, working on 2 games. Bam, bam. Starcross Starcade Special, Rose of Starcross. Rose of Starcross has a demo out that you can play for free. Link in the description. You can wishlist Starcross Starcade Special on Steam. It should be coming out very soon. There's also trailers for both of these on my channel. I think they're cool trailers. So if you would like to check those out, that would be amazing. It actually means the world to me, so. But if you actually got to this point in the video, you were either already here, so thank you, or you're just someone who's interested in game design and video games and stuff like that anyways. So I actually teach how to make games on my channel. It's a lot easier than you think to get started. I have a series called How to Make an RPG. It's for complete beginners who've never even seen code and have no experience with the engine Game Maker, which is what I teach in and what I make games in. Also, approximately 1 million games you've heard of were made in Game Maker. And as of recently, it's actually become free, at least as of my recording this right now. So yeah, and it seems like it's going to stay that way for a while. So yeah, if you want to give it a shot, this is a pretty good place to do it. I think having more game developers in the world is good because that means more video games will be in the world eventually. But if not, that's cool. I'm going to be making more videos on subjects like this, more video essay type things. So if you want to subscribe or do whatever, go for it. It helps me out. And if you really wanted to help me out, you can follow in the example of Nixionic, Null, Joseph Sandlin, Midnight, AOGO, Christian Donovan, DT, Richard DeLuca, Arya Sparks, Arnav Kumar Baskar 2.0, Maya, Thomas Mogre, Robel, Revenaris, Epic Music Mix of Legend, Soulbright, Crazy Poo Chucker, Voided, Jack Pay, Kirby 745i, Harrison, Joshua, Spacetrum, Takuni, Ruben Leavel, and all the other wonderful people who are also on my Patreon. My patrons actually helped pick the subject of this video. They also got the video a little bit early, so there's all that kind of stuff. You can read up on it if you want to by going to the link. You can also join as an unpaid member, which is a newish thing, I think, and it's really cool. So if you just want to keep up to date with stuff, you can do that too. Otherwise, I don't have much more to say. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you around, partner. Oh my god, it's so far past my bedtime.